Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Sextortion, Awareness and Prevention. My name is Carissa Rana, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss a few of the features on Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those of you wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a moment and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. The certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. And finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can also view past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Steffi Rapp from OJJDP.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steffi Rapp, and I am a Juvenile Justice Specialist at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Welcome to our webinar titled Sextortion, Awareness and Prevention. I would like to thank our partners, the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force Program, Homeland Security, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for collaborating on the development of this webinar today. We will first hear from Dr. Frank Cardaz. Dr. Cardaz is the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force Commander and Supervisory Special Agent for the state of Hawaii. Dr. Cardaz has over 30 years of law enforcement experience in Michigan, Arizona, and Hawaii. He served as the ITAC Task Force Commander in Arizona for 10 years before moving to Hawaii and continuing to work towards defending children there. Along the way, Dr. Cardaz earned a doctorate in education. He teaches, writes, and develops curriculum for several educational institutions involving a variety of law enforcement and cybersecurity topics. Next, we will hear from Special Agent Bruce Law. Mr. Law has 13+ years experience as a criminal investigator with Homeland Security Investigations. He has been with the Cyber Crimes Investigations Unit from 2005 to 2010, which includes child exploitation and intellectual property rights. Mr. Law investigated child sexual exploitation crimes in Cambodia and Thailand. He initiated and assisted with the development of the newly created HSI Honolulu Cybercrimes Group May 2016 to present. Next, we'll hear from intelligence analyst Michael Scapes. Mr. Scapes earned his bachelor's degree from Miami University of Ohio and his master's from University of Kentucky. Mr. Scapes now works in the FBI Violent Crimes Against Children Unit. Dr. Cardaz, you're ready to go. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Today I'd like to talk about sextortion and some of the related terms, review some selected case studies, analyze victim and offender characteristics. I've got 4 specific research studies that I looked at that might be of interest to our group, and provide some resources for prevention, reporting, education, and investigations. So these are not hard and fast definitions. There are other definitions, but for our purposes today, extortion has to do with obtaining money or property by threats to a victim's property or loved ones through intimidation, false claim of a right. You'll see this kind of a definition of extortion in some of the law dictionaries. Sextortion, when you add the sex part of it, you're not seeing that in the law dictionaries quite yet. But the sexual element typically involves a cyber element, often nude or sexual images, where the extortionist is blackmailing through the use of nude images or sexual images that the extortionist possesses. So blackmail is a part of this offense. It's a form of extortion in which the threat is to expose the damaging information, for our purposes, the nude images, the sexual images, exposing those to family or friends or the public or in an online environment like Facebook or a social networking site. Harassment is often a part of these offenses and might be an included offense when you consider the criminality part of it and the laws that you're going to enforce. So harassment, of course, is unwanted and annoying actions. Cyberbullying becomes a part of this because the victims are bullied and harassed and intimidated through the extortionate messages that they receive from the suspects. Catfishing comes into play here by those internet predators who fabricate online identities. Catfishing is a relatively new term, and I got this one from the Urban Dictionary. The term catfishing was inspired by the 2010 documentary called Catfish, which was subsequently followed up by a whole series of television shows which chronicle individuals who have posed as friends or mentors or boyfriends or girlfriends of others for the purposes of creating relationships, creating false relationships with the person who is then catfished by the suspect. I learned this new definition as I was doing some of the research. I hadn't heard of this one before, a capper. This is from the Urban Dictionary, and they're calling that a person who spends a lot of hours every day on the internet trying to record random girls on webcam. So you'll see that some of the people that we're going to talk about today, some of the suspects fall into this capper definition. A pretty good definition of sextortion comes from our friends at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And they say it's a form of online sexual exploitation in which non-physical forms of coercion are used, blackmail, and attempts to acquire sexual content, photos, videos, sometimes to obtain money from the child or to engage in actual sex with the child victim. So here's a quiz, everybody. You can type the year into the chat box if you wish. In what year did a report from Congress first recognize that sex offenders use child pornography to blackmail children into keeping silent about the abuse and to seduce children and lower a child's inhibitions as part of the grooming process intended to model deviant sexual behavior? Well, this looks like a pretty smart group. I'm seeing a lot of 1986s come into the chat box already. So if you said 1986, that's correct. This problem has been around for a long time. The offenders have been using images for a long time, and back in '86, remember that was pre the explosion of the internet, so it was a lot of snail mail pictures going around, but an offender would get a picture of a child and then show that picture, that physical image, that hard copy image to the child to inhibit the child from speaking or to model some behavior for part of their grooming process. So offenders have known about these techniques for a long time, and it's now exploding into the whole sextortion thing. The actual criminal offenses that we're seeing behind some of these crimes include those listed on the screen. Child pornography is involved, extortion, not a lot of actual sextortion crimes on the law books at this time, but in most jurisdictions, extortion will work as an offense. Sexual assault is often a part of these crimes, harassment. These may be federal offenses where interstate nexus exists. Just about every state that I'm aware of, and I don't know all the state laws, of course, but there's going to be child pornography, extortion, sex assault, harassment in your state code. There's also federal offenses that apply to all this. Typically, a federal offense can be applied when there's interstate nexus. Now, interstate nexus means maybe you have a victim in one state, you have a suspect in another state, but interstate nexus can also be shown when you have just about any computer traffic, because your emails, your social networking messages, they don't just travel within your state. Those messages are bouncing off of servers in lots of different states all over the U.S. And so when we can, to the extent we can show that, there's an interstate nexus involved in it, and federal offenses may apply. A little bit about some of the offenders. If you do a Google News search for sextortion, I just typed in the word sextortion and one famous character, infamous character, is Lucas Chancellor. He had 240 victims in 26 U.S. states, 3 Canadian provinces, and the UK. 31-year-old guy, lived with his parents, posed as a 15-year-old boy when he went on the internet. He said that he targeted 13 to 18-year-olds because older women were too smart for his scam. He used MySpace, Stick'em, and other social networking sites, and these guys will go from site to site, and they will convince their victims to go to other sites and sign up for other sites also. He was subsequently found in possession of 80,000 images, sentenced to 105 years in prison for producing child pornography based on the folks that were under 18 years of age that he convinced to make nude or sexual images of themselves. From his victims, and this is a statement from one of his victims who was coerced by this guy and extorted into making more images. She did not believe what she was doing, felt like a slave, had to make sure that she replied to every message. This guy was very demanding of her, threatening her to expose her images, and this unfortunate victim just felt like a slave to this guy. So from our academic research studies, what we're seeing is, and I'm going to talk about 4 different studies here just quickly. This one is from the Crimes Against Children Research Center, Janice Wolak and David Finkelhor. They did a survey of over 1,600 victims. 90% of those victims were recruited for the survey from a Facebook advertisement that they posted. Some of these victims included persons who were involved in face-to-face relationships, but also involved people who were only in online relationships. And like good researchers, they say the study does not necessarily constitute a representative sample of all sextortion victims, but what they did find from the 1,600 they did, ages 18 to 21, and some of these incidents had occurred before these victims were 18 years old. 83% of those responding to the survey were women, 14% men, 78% Caucasian, 13% Hispanic. Victims are saying things like, I was in a controlling, emotionally abusive relationship, finally had the strength to break away. The victim was still trapped by these offender's threats to post the nude pictures. So these pictures get out there, they get into the offender's hands, there's no recalling them, the suspects keep these pictures and then they use them to continue to abuse their victims. Another victim said, a guy in his 20s told me he loved me and got me to send him pictures of me nude, and after she didn't want to continue sending the pictures, he threatened to create a Facebook page with the nudes on it. Typical tactic of one of the offenders. This is another study from the National Center. They reviewed 801 reports from their cyber tip line from 2013 to 2015. 78% of the incidents involved female children and 12% involved male in this particular study. And when you download the PowerPoints, if you're able to, you can refer to these research studies yourself and take a better look at them. I'm just reviewing some of the highlights of those studies. So in 801 reports to the cyber tip line, 78% were female, 12% were male. Average age at the time of the incident was 15, and curiously, the age range for females started a little bit younger, went from 8 to 17, and the age range for males went from 11 to 17. I don't really have an explanation for that. In this research, the reporting person, the victims knew or suspected that other children were also being targeted by this same offender. So we know these people are going after multiple victims. And the offenders in this research used multiple online platforms or networking sites. So they'll go from Facebook to Instagram to Twitter and back and forth to these networking sites. They talked about some of the offender motives, typically to acquire additional and often increasingly more explicit sexual content. That was 76% of the respondents. In 6%, they wanted money from the child, to have sex with the child, and another 6%, and in 12%, the objective could not be determined. So in 76%, they wanted more images, and you got down to some of these offenders actually wanting money and wanting to have sex with the child. Another research study from the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings by Witz and Poplin studied media reports of 78 sextortion cases, 63 from federal jurisdictions, 39 from others, and they also included cases that involved Israel, Mexico, and the Netherlands. And these researchers also interviewed some prosecutors. What they found is that 91% of the victims involved social media manipulation, where minors were the victims, and 43% involved computer hacking. So these folks found that there was some hacking involved in some of these cases. Now, hacking is a tough one to define. Some people think they've been hacked, but they have not. But according to this research, 43% of these victims were victims of hacking, and that's how the sextortion came about. According to this study, sextortionists are prolific repeat players, and they talked about at least 10 victims in 25 of the cases they studied. So that means in 25 of the cases, 25 of the offenders had at least 10 victims. In 13 cases, 13 of the offenders had at least 20 victims, and in 4 cases, there were more than 100 victims. Now, we're not getting that number of reports in, so we know a lot of these victims are just not reporting these cases to law enforcement. Our volume is not that high. And finally, a research study about bullying, which is not directly related to sextortion, but it's kind of a peripheral problem in this arena. And this is from the National Academy of Science. They talk about the things that are happening with the bullying victims, including sleep disturbances, stomach aches, headaches, mental health issues, cognitive functioning problems. So we're seeing these kinds of problems in our victims: depression, anxiety, high-risk activities, suicidal ideations, and actual suicides, very sad to say in some of these cases. These victims fear law enforcement because some of the suspects are telling them, hey, you created child pornography, so now you are a suspect. The victims are too young to understand that we in law enforcement are not going to come after these kids. We want the suspects. But the victims are made to suffer humiliation, depression, fear, and we know, unfortunately, that some of the victims have committed suicide. Take, for example, Amanda Todd, the young girl in Canada, a case that was widely publicized in the media, took her own life in 2012 after a stranger threatened to publish photos of her breasts online. Later on, take a look at that link at the bottom of that page and you'll read her unfortunate situation. So for investigators and prosecutors, we have a lot of challenges besides the fact that, like all of you, we don't have enough staff to work these cases. We know that some of our victims just want the problem to stop. They don't necessarily want to pursue prosecution. I've had victims that I'll contact once, they'll contact me once and I'll never hear from them again because they don't want to be exposed, and I don't blame them. They don't want to necessarily pursue prosecution. They just want the problem to stop. Sometimes the victims blame themselves. We also have members of the public that want to blame the victims. We have members of the public that want to blame the families. You know, we always encourage everybody to do a better job of supervising their kids. We know how difficult that is. For law enforcement and prosecutors, we know that offenders have ever-improving anonymity capabilities. They can use encryption. We have internet service providers who are not cooperating with us sometimes. They don't retain the data that we need. We are seeing overseas communications. Offenders might be overseas. Internet service providers might be in another country. So we have a whole another set of legal hoops we have to jump through to send a subpoena overseas. And when the offender is in another jurisdiction or continent, it makes enforcement that much more difficult. Typical crime prevention tips that you've probably heard before, but I'm going to go through them again for you. We try to encourage everybody to keep your pictures G-rated. Assume that anything you post online is going to be seen by everyone. Use strong passwords. Do not share them. Change those passwords periodically. Cover that webcam and turn off your electronic devices when they're not in use. You know, there are programs that you can download that might come attached to an email as an executable file that can turn on your webcam when you don't even know it's on. It can turn on your microphones when you don't even know that's on. So you got to be careful about those things. Turn off those devices, cover those webcams. Keep your operating systems up to date. Older, outdated operating systems can be hacked. Don't open those unusual emails. Don't post your name, age, date of birth, school, hobbies. That's what offenders look at to try to contact you. There are some cleaning programs. You want to be careful with the CC Cleaner by Piniform or Derek's Boot and Nuke DBAN. They're both free, but be careful. Make sure you know how to use these before you nuke your whole hard drive and wipe out all your data. And I encourage everybody to report those offenses to your local ICAC. There are 63 throughout the United States. You can Google it and find who your local ICAC representative is. FBI takes these reports. Homeland Security does. And most importantly, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Cyber Tip Line takes these reports, and then they do some of the preliminary work on those and send them out to the appropriate jurisdictions. I got one in the other day that is going to involve us in Hawaii and also a possible offender in Oregon, and we will then closely work with the folks in Oregon to try to resolve that offense. For more sextortion tips, just go to Google and type in sextortion prevention tips, and you'll see some good ones there, and then you can ferret through those to decide which ones you think are good tips and which ones are not. But there's no shortage of prevention tips out there for you. For law enforcement folks, you know, you're going to need to know who your local ICAC and federal colleagues are. You're going to need to know how to get forensics done, digital forensics on devices. Most of your ICAC groups have forensics folks. If your own agency doesn't have that, for federal offenses, the FBI, the HSI, they have forensics people that do that kind of work. Be sure you know who your social workers, mental health professionals, school counselors, and school resource officers are before you go into these investigations. I talked with one of my colleagues on another island just about an hour ago, and he's about to interview a sextortion victim, a young person who has left school now, possibly because of the images that went up, and the offender has been blackmailing this person and the ridicule that this person is feeling. But I counseled my colleague to make sure that he knows who the social workers are, the mental health professionals, because it's going to be more about helping this victim than it is about finding this offender. Yes, we'll try to find the offender, but we really want to keep these kids safe, keep these kids from harming themselves, try to help them rebuild their characters because they make mistakes. We all made mistakes when we were young. And these kids are making bad mistakes that are following them around now, and the depression that they're suffering is really troublesome. Federal statutes, I've got some federal statutes listed here that have to do with cyber stalking, computer fraud and abuse, interstate threats, sexual exploitation and child pornography. These can all be used surrounding some of these sextortion cases. Every state and local jurisdiction has, well, the state jurisdictions, not the locals necessarily, but every state's going to have extortion, blackmail, sex assault, harassment, stalking, and computer crime statutes. And so those crimes can be applied in your jurisdiction when these offenses occur. Law enforcement investigators, what you're going to have to do in some of these cases is starting with a preservation letter. A preservation letter is a notice that gets sent out to an internet service provider asking them to retain data. So the preservation letter can go out, it can be faxed or emailed in most cases to Google, Verizon, Cox Cable, whoever your internet service provider is that's involved in the communications behind these sextortion cases, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Send them a preservation letter. That tells them they're going to keep the data. That gives you time to do a subpoena and or search warrant, depending on what's needed in your jurisdiction and or what's needed by that internet service provider. So the preservation letter goes out first, that's followed by a subpoena or a search warrant, and that allows you to get subscriber information in the case of a subpoena and content information in the case of a search warrant, assuming that the social networking site has retained that data, and not all of them do, so it's not a promise. Digital forensic analysis is a part of these investigations, like I said, and you may end up having to do sexual assault investigations where these children have actually met with a suspect, in which case you may be doing a rape kit, entire rape investigation. For educators, it's good to know who your mental health assistants and suicide prevention folks are. Try to think about those school policies that encourage students to report these acts. Think about student contracts, anti-bullying contracts that might be helpful in these situations. Get to know who your local and federal law enforcement officer resources are. Share this information with your PTA groups, and please visit the cyber tip line to learn how you would report these to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which also has some great resource information for you to learn more about protecting children online. So I'm going to circle back now to the research findings, and these are the research findings and recommendations from the 4 studies that I talked about. Volak and Finkelhort talk about increasing public awareness, mobilizing the education system, trying to get bystanders and other people to stop these perpetrators and support the victims. So you want to encourage kids in the schools to report when things are happening to other kids. Kids are missing from school. Why are kids missing from school? Sometimes they're missing because they were embarrassed in school over something that happened. So we need to get support for these victims. And they talk about encouraging the tech industry to develop interventions, improve the experience of victims who report, adopt practices that prohibit sextortion. Those are difficult challenges. The tech industry sometimes has a difficult time adopting some of those practices, but we want to encourage those social networking sites to do some of those things. And we want to increase law enforcement's capacity to respond to sextortion cases and improve our sensitivity to the victims. Sometimes in law enforcement, we get a little bit hard-headed and we think, oh, you know, these victims got to get smarter, or these parents have to do more to stop these kids. But it's a real challenge. It's real hard for parents to control kids. You know, the kids walking around with a cell phone all day and internet access to wireless internet just about everywhere you go. So it's very hard for parents to control those things, and we appreciate that. We understand. The Witts and Poplin recommendations are for a federal sextortion statute, and I know there is one, at least one in the works at the federal level. But some of those other existing federal crimes already apply, so those can be used in the interim. They talk about how account hacking would be more difficult if stronger passwords were used. They want prosecutors and investigators to operate on the presumption that sextortion is taking place everywhere. I concur with that. It's an unmeasured offense. We don't really have good statistics yet on how much it's taking place, but it's like a lot of crimes that go unreported we don't know about until later. They recommend parents and teachers try to establish a non-judgmental, no questions asked reporting regime for sexual exploitation, and they hope to enable victims to come forward and speak up more. The National Academy on the Bullying Study talk about social media companies implementing policies for preventing, identifying, responding to bullying on their platforms, and publishing those policies on their websites. A very compelling video is at this website. I'm not going to take your time today to play it, but when you get a chance, take a look at this one. Google online enticement, sextortion PSA. It's very compelling, 60-second PSA brought to us by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Just describes exactly what's happening with this problem. So please take a look at this one when you get an opportunity. The National Center and the DOJ tell us, and I agree with this, anything private you share online could be used against you. If somebody demands sexual images from you, stop and report it immediately, and there's the link to the cybertipline.org. So try to remember your federal, state, and local partnerships, your ICAC task forces, HSI, and FBI. We are there to try to assist you. It's been my observation in doing this kind of work now for 16, 18 years that we, in this era of law enforcement, are pretty lucky. We now have proactive, undercover methods to identify these folks who sexually abuse minors. In the past, we had to wait for those reports of child abuse to come in, and they were not reported as much as they could be. But now, using undercover techniques, we can go out and proactively seek out and apprehend offenders, and that's been some of the most rewarding work that I've been involved in law enforcement. So just a little pitch there for the folks that are working undercover. I know there's some ICAC folks in this audience today. And with that, I want to flip it over to Bruce. So Bruce, if you're ready, take it away, sir.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. This next case involves sextortion on a global network. It transcended many different borders and continents, from Europe to Australia to Southeast Asia and the United States. It involved mainly the use of Facebook, and I guess you could say this one involved a lot of catfishing. It was on a commercial scale, purely for monetary gain. So how we got this lead, it was brought to our attention, our Philippines office, which we call the Homeland Security Investigations Office in Attaché, Manila. They were requested by Interpol, the Scotland Police, National Crime Center in the Philippines, to assist them with a sextortion type case that resulted in the death of a 17-year-old boy. What happened, they were able to trace an IP address, and it resolved back to the Philippines. There were multiple networks engaged in this similar sextortion case, and it identified the location in the Philippines. The operation was first referred to as Operation Cilantro. Later, Interpol renamed it to Operation Strike Back. There are approximately 58 people that were arrested in 2014 in various locations in Luzon, Philippines. They were suspected of their involvement in this global cyber sex scam. Luzon, Philippines is the northernmost archipelago in the Philippines, and Manila is located in there. There are at least 100 victims from different countries who were blackmailed online, and that included victims from USA, Hong Kong, Singapore, Scotland, England, Australia, and also other parts of the European Union. So what happened in this case was there was the 17-year-old male victim. He believed that he was engaging in sexual activity online with a teenage female from Illinois on Facebook. Unbeknownst to him, after attempts from the blackmail agents, he did sexual activity online through webcam. His sexual activity was being covertly recorded. These cyber blackmail agents then extorted him to transfer money to them or risk his video of sexual activity be released to his friends and family, and also on YouTube. The 17-year-old male victim was told he might as well commit suicide if he didn't pay, which shortly thereafter he jumped off a bridge to his death. Information was shared between Interpol, the Digital Crime Center, Hong Kong Police Force, Singapore Police Force, the Philippines National Police, and other social networking sites. The collective effort led to the identification of between 190 to 195 individuals working for 3 separate organized crime groups that operated out of the Philippines. The cooperation between Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and the UK's, United Kingdom's National Crime Agency led to the identification of sextortion victims in Hong Kong, Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, UK, and the USA. These perpetrators were operating almost like in industrial scale call center style offices in the Philippines. These call centers, they were like telemarketers, a big commercial type office filled with telephones, computer screens, and whatnot. These cyber blackmail agents were provided with training and they were also offered bonuses, incentives such as holidays, cash, mobile phones, all for just reaching their financial targets. There was, I guess, spreadsheets and a chalkboard that they would keep tabs on what their goals were and how much of the goals they reached. Blackmail demands range from $500 to $3,000 U.S. currency. In addition, Asia-based networks, there were also evidence of individuals and groups operating out of Africa, targeting victims throughout the European Union, and a similar call center style type sextortion activity. Again, this was named Operation Strike Back. If you wanted more information, you can Google that. So the social networks were utilized, and through social networking sites, these cyber blackmail agents led the victims to believe that he or she was engaging in sexual activities online with a teenage female or male. These cyber blackmail agents covertly record the sexual activity. The victim is told to transfer money to these call centers via Western Union, or they will distribute the recordings to their friends and families or post online to YouTube in an effort to embarrass them. And this video is part of that takedown and showing you the call center in Manila, or actually in Luzon. Adam, could the video play?
Sure, we'll get that queued up here in just a moment. Please bear with us.
This is the call center. These are some of the people that were in the call center that are being detained, and you can see all the laptops. There's the board that had the goals and the targets that they call or telemarketing, and those are the different targets that they were targeting. And that concludes our part of this presentation. We'd like to introduce Michael Scapes from the FBI, who will present the next part of it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I want to also thank you for the work you do on behalf of the children out there. I appreciate you tuning in. And we're getting the presentation back up and running. Give me 1 second. The presentation, it says high school senior class, 24 students down below. All right. So I know we're going to talk about sextortion here today, but what I want to do, since I have a great audience who have the opportunity to intervene on behalf of children, I want to touch on child sex abuse overall. So what I want you to think of is if you have a high school senior class of 24 students. And what we know about child sex abuse is that by the age of 18, 1 in 4 girls will experience child sex abuse, and by the age of 18, 1 in 6 boys will experience child sex abuse. So in a scenario, if you then split this classroom down the middle, 12 girls on the left, 12 boys on the right, I'm sorry, the PowerPoint went down. We're going to give it, just hang in there. It's going to be good. Stick around, I promise.
Hey, this is Frank, Mike. Why don't I take a couple of the questions that have come into the chat box while we're waiting?
I think that's a great idea, Frank. Thank you.
So I got a question that says criminal offense slide. Do these criminal offenses apply to minors as well? And the answer is yes. All of those criminal statutes that you saw would apply when minors are victims, as well as when minors are suspects, with variations from state to state. So I have to put the caveat on there. Those are going to be crimes whether the victim or the suspect is the criminal. Now there's going to be different variations on sentencing for all of those offenses. And when the victim is a minor, in many states there's enhanced sentencing for the suspect in those crimes if they're committing a crime against a minor. So I hope that answers that question, and if not, send it again in the chat room. Another question is, what is the parent's role and reaction to these cases? The kids are so young. So it varies. You know, parents are sometimes humiliated and ashamed themselves on behalf of their children. Some parents will want law enforcement to go after these suspects. Other parents don't want the embarrassment, the humiliation, the court dates that are going to come behind their child having to appear in court if the thing ever goes to trial. So you'll have some parents that are pro law enforcement and some that are anti. And I don't mean that they don't like law enforcement, they just don't want to enforce the law because they don't want to humiliate their child. I hope that makes sense. In any event, we encourage parents to take an empathetic role, consider what mistakes kids make, and try to help to rehabilitate that child instead of taking a real punitive approach to the children and to the victims. And Mike, are we farther along, or do I want to work on some more questions?
If you could have one or two more questions, Frank. And the other thing, if I could just add on one
Sure.
for 1 second. A parent's response, what we like to give a little guidance is, you know, to get to a point where your child is going to come to you to really tell you about something horrible that they're going through. And it takes lead-up work into that. And the best thing a parent can typically do is to say, you know, I'm glad you told me, you know, this isn't your fault, and we're going to take care of it. And those are typically things that we advise parents on how to address that, and then go to law enforcement or whatever entity that is so that we can identify that subject on behalf of the kids. But Frank, if you could take another one or two, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, thanks. Those are great suggestions, Mike. One of the questions is, will a preservation letter be effective if the offender goes into the deep web? And the answer is maybe. The deep web itself is not the entirety, the entity called the deep web is not something we can slap a subpoena on. There's no single entity called the deep web, but everybody inside the deep web is communicating across the deep web on the Tor network, and there's a computer back there somewhere behind these folks. So if we can get into that and find out the internet protocol addresses, because every computer connected to the internet has an IP address, if we can get to that level of our suspect within the deep web, then yes, possibly we can serve a preservation letter onto that internet service provider that the person's connecting to. Deep web is a difficult target. Another question is, do we know if offenders are targeting children because they are naive and they can't prey on older targets due to intelligence, or is it due to pedophilia? The answer is a little of both. I don't know of any specific research that has looked at that actual question. I think both ideas are in play. Some of the children are naive, but the suspects know that the children are naive, and that's why they're not picking on older targets. As we saw in the case of Lucas Chancellor, he specifically picked on younger kids because he knew that older people were too wise to his methods. Pedophilia can come into play with some of these folks, and some of them are just sexual deviants who want to humiliate and collect more images, whether they're pedophiles or not.
Frank, can I hop in one more time there? I apologize.
Yes, thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Mike with the FBI. You know, we get a lot of questions about that too, about are the kids naive? Some people say that the kids made a dumb mistake, and I always push back on that. You know, today's world is just different. Kids don't view it the way we do, and I don't think that's just naivety. Or, you know, you'd be surprised how many adults become sextortion victims as well. So the internet has brought really the world together, and kids today, although it's a little bit cliche, they don't think of a stranger as a stranger. They think of a stranger as a friend they haven't met yet. So it's a different world, and I just, you know, the reality is that they're victims. Subjects very much prey upon these kids, and I always try to keep it in that light, in that respect.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Frank, I could also comment on that. Talking to some children, they think it would never happen to them, or that they're wise enough of the world, but they still lack the experiences. And a lot of times they think that it will stop if they don't do anything, but it never does stop, and they continue and they go, and because of the lack of experiences, so they ride along with it, so to speak.
Great points. Yeah, thanks, Mike and Bruce, for both of those comments. Another question is, there is a strong push for one-to-one tech devices in schools these days. If sextortion occurs on a school-issued device, wouldn't they be responsible for providing the access that led to the situation? Are there any data from schools about these issues occurring on school-issued devices? I don't know of any data from schools. Maybe our other presenters do. And as far as holding the schools responsible for the crimes because they issued the device, I suppose that's a legal argument that could be taken up in a civil case. I don't know how far it would get.
This is Steffi from OJJDP, and I just want to make a comment about adolescent development and something that educators and social workers and school resource officers can talk to kids about, that it's developmentally appropriate for kids to start exploring their sexual identity when they turn, when they become teenagers or starting to become pre-teenagers, even in some cases. And so in the past, kids might explore their sexuality or their sexual identity and kiss someone behind a tree, and that's it. It's done. And there's not a picture of it, and it's a moment, and it was either a positive or a negative experience, but it was a moment that passed. And nowadays, because technology is so embedded into our youth's lives, that for a child, we have to make sure that, we know that they are developmentally at a place where they may want to start exploring their sexuality, but they absolutely can't do it online, because it doesn't become just a moment in time that then becomes a memory. If they do something online, it lasts there forever. And that's why I think we have to really target public awareness and education of preteens and teens, because, as I said, it's natural for them developmentally to start exploring their sexuality, but we don't want them doing that online.
All right. I'm going to get back moving on this. I apologize. If we have any more difficulties, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to speak to the presentation and not take as many breaks here. So in theory, we have this theoretical classroom here, 12 boys, 12 girls on each side. So what I'm trying to push home here, and I'm sorry it's taken a while, is that in every classroom, high school classroom across the United States, there's a statistical possibility of 5 kids being sexually abused in that class. It's striking in a very unfortunate way, and if you exponentially put that across the country, it's even more concerning. So I'm going to jump into the actual research that I conducted in the FBI cases, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of the information we pulled from that. I hope it's interesting to you. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and I think we'll answer at the end. So although stranger danger is a bit of a misnomer, we always thought about the playground as a possible preying field for these offenders. But the reality of today is that the playground for these kids has changed. It's no longer in the physical form, but it's online across all of these websites and platforms that you see here. Frank hit a lot about what sextortion really is. I'm going to talk about Amanda Todd's experience. These are some snippets from her YouTube video, and we'll see what we can get out of this here. Okay, so in 7th grade, and the reason I use Amanda Todd, it really mirrors the experience of a lot of kids who go through sextortion. So in 7th grade, she goes online and she does some webcamming with her friends. One of the subjects asked these 2 young girls to flash the web camera. She does, and about a year later, an individual she doesn't know comes back to her and says he knows all the friends, the family, the schools that she goes to. And he says, if you don't continue to produce for me, I'm going to send your photos to all your family and friends, and I'm going to release them to the school. He actually follows through on that threat, and not only is she going through the torment of being a victim of sextortion, but additionally, the kids at school begin to harass her because of the images that were leaked to her. As time goes on, she travels to different schools. The offender follows her, continues to threaten her, and those new school classmates begin to harass her again. She develops anxiety, depression, something that we see across the spectrum of these sextortion victims. And about 5 months after she posts this YouTube video, she unfortunately takes her life. It's really our first insight into the devastating impact of sextortion on these child victims. Unfortunately, it's not the lone example of the devastating impact on these victims. Okay. So in the last 4 years, the FBI sextortion caseload has increased 472%. Now, I think this is a double-edged sword here. One is that I believe it's an effective technique that subjects are using to target children for the protection of child pornography. Additionally, though, the FBI and other federal agencies and our local partners are allocating resources to address this threat. But to substantiate the claim that I think it's a more increasing technique these offenders use, I want to give you an example. Frank touched on it. In a year-and-a-half time frame, NCTAC collected 801 cyber tips regarding the sextortion of a child victim. What we know is approximately 40 to 50 of those cyber tips indicated that that child victim was suicidal and or had attempted suicide. Again, devastating impact. Additionally, Frank mentioned the subject, Lucas Michael Chancellor. He was a Jacksonville subject. One young brave girl, the first victim advocate that the FBI was able to basically rescue, identify, rescue, and has become a victim advocate. Because she came forward, 350 additional child victims came forward by that one subject. So what we did was we did a Glamour article piece, and we highlighted every username that Chancellor, the subject, had ever used to abuse these kids. When that article was published, 30 additional children came forward believing that they were Chancellor victims. The interesting thing about that was that they were victims of sextortion. However, they were not Chancellor victims. It speaks to that growing threat, the growing number of subjects who are doing this to target children. A little bit about the victims per offender. Lucas Michael Chancellor, 300 plus out of Jacksonville. We have Patrick Killen out of Miami, 200 plus. He targeted boys. Next we have Josh Gear out of Atlanta. If you could tier these offenders somehow, even though they're all egregious and terrible, he's one of the more egregious ones, and I want to get into that a little bit. And then Chris Ducruff, 10 plus victims. Now, what you notice is there's a wide spectrum of the number of victims per offender. These guys don't have a quota. The only thing stopping them from gaining more victims is law enforcement apprehension of these subjects. For the cases we know that oftentimes there are 100 number of victims, we have found that 20% of these subjects had molested a child in the past, were actively demanding sexual acts from the children, or had planned to travel for sexual physical contact with these children, but luckily were apprehended by law enforcement. The average age of the child victim is 14 years old, but what we have seen, the youngest is 8 years old. The slide that you're seeing here is the websites and applications that these offenders use to target the children. What we've found to be is that the #1 website or application used is Facebook. The #2 is Kick Messenger app. #3 will be Skype. And #4 is Omegle, which tagline is literally talk to strangers. Now, I want to talk about this for a second. These subjects use a variety of platforms to target the children. It's just like any predator. They're going to go where the prey are. They often use Facebook. The most common scheme these subjects use is they might create a fake Facebook profile account. And they're going to take an attractive 15, 16-year-old male's photo offline, put it as their own fake Facebook profile, and they begin to friend as many children as they can. What they do is they gain their trust, eventually convince one of these child victims to send over an image, and once they have that image, they'll begin the sextortion process. Kick is a great app for these subjects to use because it's semi-anonymous. It's a great meeting place for subjects with children. And then if these subjects are not targeting hands-on offenses with these kids or are not targeting some kind of financial return, what their goal is usually to get these kids to produce long-duration streaming video, usually on Skype. So, and I want to talk about that for 1 second, is that we're not talking about 2, 3 photographs a day. These subjects demand 50, 60, 100 different photographs a day from one child. Very explicit, very focused requests on what they want these children to do. A number of these kids in victim interviews have said that they've been at a grandparent's over the holidays, and that subject made them go into the bathroom and produce explicit material because if they didn't, they were afraid their images would be leaked. Numerous times, children said that they were made to go into the bathroom at school and produce images because the subject has pinged them on the phone. And that's what's so unique about this violation, is that these subjects have constant access to these kids because these kids all have access to the internet these days 24/7. But I want to talk about the subject. What we know about our traditional CP subjects, the average age is about 38 years old. What we found about the traditional sextortion subject is that the average age is 24 years old. These subjects are much younger than who we think are traditionally the subjects of child pornography cases. If you look in Ohio, you should see a red dot. That's Greg Kasarczyk to the left. Those orange dots are his child victims populating across the United States. If we start in the upper left, that's Josh Gear, he was 21. Jordan Kirby was 21. Chris Duprep was 18. Stefan Mislich, 23. Greg Kasarczyk, 23. This is a much younger subject profile. And I want to talk about Josh Gear a little bit. I mentioned him earlier. Again, he's out of Atlanta. Josh Gear not only wanted to sextort children, but he also had plans to abduct a child and basically sexually torture them. So that's his abduction kit. And what you see here, when the agent served the warrant, they found all of these items, as you can see, different kinds of material that he would use for that abduction and to abuse the children. So we highlight this because, you know, these aren't just pictures. These aren't just images. We know 20% of these subjects are actively or trying to put hands on children. It speaks to the egregiousness of the crime, and it just speaks to the type of things these kids are going through. A few years ago, we put out a product the FBI did, and we talked about, we believe the most common way for subjects to go after children was going to be through some of the hacking that Frank spoke about earlier. So what that means is, you know, they might do some kind of malware, and it would take over a child's webcam and be able to capture them while they're changing in the room, or a subject would use some type of virus and be able to pull images or videos off of that child's computer. And we thought, hey, the most common thing they're going to ask for is images and videos. What we actually found, though, was much worse. First off, while there are hackers, the vast majority of these individuals are social engineers. Again, they're going to pretend to be somebody else online, they're going to gain the kids' trust, and they're going to begin the sextortion process. Troubling, though, is that what we also found was that these subjects were demanding that a primary child victim sexually abuse younger brothers and sisters, record those images, and send them to the subject. We also found that these subjects demanded that a primary victim would have the subjects would have the primary victim gain images of a friend from school, and they would then begin targeting those kids at school. We also found that over 50% of these subjects pretend to be female. The reason for that is that they may play a game of truth and dare a child to flash the camera like you saw with Amanda Todd, and then begin the sextortion process. Out of the age groups of these child victims, we found that 43% were in the 14 to 15 age range, 35% were in 16 to 17, and 22% were 13 years or younger. But I believe as time goes on, and we've seen this happen, children are becoming more adept at using technology at a younger age. And I really believe that piece of pie, that 22% for 13 years or younger, is going to increase and grow over time. What I've done here is I've uploaded some of the conversations that subjects use to target these children. This is one example that a subject sent to all of his victims. It was very scripted. I actually took out more of the egregious demands and some of the stuff that he put towards the kids. He would say, I'm not really here to ruin your life. I'm just here to enjoy you for a bit. This is an email back to that subject by a victim. Why me? I don't deserve this. I hate this. You have no idea how scared I am. I know I'm a good person. I just want this to go away. I really just want everything to go away. So this is Chris Ducrest, one of his conversations with the victim. He asks, you want this to be in the past for good and never to haunt you again? The victim replies, yes. And of course, that was the lead up to another demand for explicit material from a child victim. Dear, the victim asks, my chance? He says, what? Go on there now, which is probably Skype or some kind of live streaming video service, and says, I'll swear to God, I'll expose you to everyone I know. So, I mean, think about this, right? We're talking about an average age of 14. They're being told that everybody they care about in their lives are going to be sent images and videos. It is the most devastating thing going on for them in their life right now. We often see depression, substance abuse, performing poorly in school. We even had one young girl who starved herself because she thought by starving herself she would be admitted in the hospital and she'd finally be out of the grasp of her subject. Sadly, that's not as far as it goes. In the FBI cases, we identified at least 10 plus minors. Children attempted suicide, 2 actually committed suicide. But if you go on to the internet and you search for sextortion, you'll find plenty more examples where children are unfortunately taking their life because of this victimization. As we go on, the interconnectivity of society, again, it's growing. Children are using these technologies at a younger age, so we think the victim profile is going to decrease in age. Subjects have begun to learn from one another. And then just the workload for law enforcement, like Frank alluded to. We're talking about child adolescent forensic interviewers. Those are the individuals who actually interview child victims for the FBI because it takes a unique skill set to do so. Victim specialists who employ services for the child victim. And then the victim identification piece takes a good amount of work. We're talking about hundreds of victims per subject. The good news is, though, that when we get these subjects, and we often do, they are put away for a long time. Patrick Killen, 139 years. Chancellor, 105 years. Gear, 30 years. Ducref, 35 years. Most of these guys are getting put away at federal level for the production of child pornography. So, again, as time goes on, we sadly believe that sextortion will continue to increase as a technique for these offenders. And that's not saying that any of the other threats to children are decreasing. This is just one more thing we have to care about. We have to pay attention to and mitigate. A growing number of these individuals are hands-on offenders. They've started to target victims' family and friends. And again, children will be victimized at a younger age as time goes on. What we're doing is we're trying to get the word out. Example today is a webinar, but we're working with partners all across the government in an effort to educate children to come forward and to prevent victimization in the future. I really appreciate your time. I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to all the presenters. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for hanging in there with our technical difficulties. I'm sorry about that. We are going to take a few questions now. One question, Mike, maybe you can answer this. Is there any data out there from schools about these issues occurring on school-issued devices or actually in schools with school personnel?
Yeah, so there's no information about school-issued devices. I mean, of course, if they're using a computer and these kids are checking Facebook, social media at a school, of course they're being targeted there if they're child victims. But we're really working with school resource officers to identify education for these kids about sextortion and the ability for those kids to go to the school resource officer. So we have begun collecting data. Nothing about school-issued devices, though, that's, I think, worth mentioning right now.
Thank you, Mike. Frank?
Steffi, I can comment on that also.
Okay, please do.
Yeah.
Please do.
In the past, yeah, the schools who left their devices open and available without those parental controls or controls of their own, it would happen. But we're seeing less of that now because a lot of schools don't even allow the kids to go onto social networking sites, so it's blocked. The firewalls are stronger and they have controls over the school access devices.
Thank you, Bruce. What is the parent role for kids that are using a lot of technology? What can we tell them? What can we tell them to do?
This is Frank. We can continue to tell them the things we've always been telling them. It's the tired old song of watch your kids around computers, but it's a difficult message to get across. In the case of sextortion, we want them to be empathetic. We want them to not be punitive because we really want to save kids' lives, and we know that just adding to the depression and the humiliation that these kids feel is not going to help them. So parents need to be protective and do their best to keep their kids safe on the internet and to be vigilant. We understand that's a difficult thing to do, but continue to be vigilant, but also be empathetic to these things that are happening to our children.
Thank you, Frank. Bruce, this is a question for you for the case, the international case you discussed. Were any of the threats followed through by blackmailers?
I would have to get back to that. I'm not sure of that. I would have to check, but yeah, no, I don't know that answer right now.
This is Mike. I just want to say from a child victim perspective, we found about 50% of these subjects typically do follow through on their threats to release those images to the friends and family. It's up in the air, and the reason for that, if a subject does release those images to friends and family, that loops them in to know that something is going horribly wrong in that child's life, right?
Mike, this question is also for you. How difficult is it to prosecute these types of offenders?
Not very difficult. The only difficulty we run into is when a subject is sometimes under 18, and I saw a question kind of speaking to that. Different jurisdictions will approach that differently, along with if these offenders are targeting adults. If they're targeting adults only, then you may only get a 4 or 5 year sentence. Currently, there's a congresswoman, I believe, out of Maine who's pushing for a federal statute for stricter sentencing on adult sextortion. So hopefully that's down the line because it's devastating to adults too. But from a child victim perspective, it's pretty easy to go after these individuals and get them long-term sentences because, again, it is production of child pornography.
Thank you, Mike. Mike, here's another question for you. Would you think a more high-profile person's child may be more vulnerable to these types of crimes?
That's a really good question. I really think that the subjects who go online looking for kids are not looking for a specific kid. They're looking for a quantity of kids. So whatever way is best for them to go after that, that's typically what they do. And if that well-known child has more access to the services or would feel more inclined to come forward, maybe they wouldn't do that. That's a great question. We haven't seen that, though.
Thank you. Frank, this question is for you. What can we do to make sure that prosecutors are not allowed to have charges reduced to simple battery?
We, at my end of law enforcement, do not have control over prosecutorial decisions, and the system, both federally, state, and locally, is geared towards plea bargaining. We are going to try to, the prosecutors that is, are going to try to make examples of high-profile kinds of cases, but at the end of the day, the prosecutor's got to weigh the strength of his evidence or her evidence in the case, and that includes, did you get a statement from the victim? Do you have a cooperative victim? Did you get a statement from the suspect? Do you have a confession that you can use? Do you have evidence? Do you have digital forensics evidence? So they've got to collect all those things, and they've got to try to build a case that can convince a judge or jury that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So we don't have much control over that. Prosecutors are going to continue to make those kinds of decisions, and the best thing we can do in law enforcement is to build the best case we can by collecting the best evidence we can, get those statements, get those search warrant results, subpoenas, get that forensic evidence collected, and build the best case that we can so that the prosecutors have strong bargaining positions and or can make their case in court.
Thank you, Frank. Frank, do you know how many victims become involved in the juvenile justice system?
I really don't have numbers to victims involved in the juvenile justice system. No, I don't have numbers like that. Mike or Bruce?
No, not that I'm, we don't have numbers either.
I'll speak to this quickly. We're just starting to keep track of this data, right? And something we're going to monitor. If we're talking about another form of sex offenders, there's a myth out there that child abuse victims become offenders, and I think it's a great disservice we do to the victims, and it's not accurate, the data shows. So as time goes on, we'll monitor that, but that's something we don't know, and I think we should be cautious to say that a victim could be an offender. I know you're not saying that, but I go around the presentations a lot, and people talk about that, and that's not accurate.
Thank you, Mike and Frank. An audience participant. Oh, go ahead, Bruce.
Sorry. On Mike's note, too, a lot of times when we talk with the suspects, some of them would say that they've been offended when they were younger also, but we can't prove that.
That's a great point, Bruce, and I'm glad you brought that up, because what we found, though, is a high number of individuals say they were abused younger age, but then once they are sentenced, and we've done blind data research, a number of them recant it. It's a defense mechanism used to get lighter sentencing.
This question is from an educator. What evidence do do educators, people that work in schools and the communities need to call the police to believe that they have a sextortion case on their hands?
This is Frank. I would say when in doubt, call the police. Don't make that judgment yourself and then be sorry later because you did not call the police and now you have a child who's missing or has harmed themselves. So if you have information, share it with the police. It may not be good information, but that's okay. The cops can figure that stuff out for you. So if you have a suspicion, don't hesitate to notify the authorities.
I want to jump in real quickly, too. The FBI does not treat sextortion child victims as offenders, and I want to make that very clear. So we had pushback from law enforcement when sextortion was in the novice stages and people didn't really know how to identify it. But local law enforcement is doing a great job these days and pushing it upwards and following through. But if there is any pushback by locals, don't be afraid to take it to HSI or the FBI.
Thank you. This is a question for you, Frank. Are there developmentally appropriate materials to share with educators?
The best ones, yes, and I can recall the stuff that's being put out by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and at their website you'll find some great information about it. And I'm not sure what they have specific to sextortion, but they do have things broken out by various age levels there.
Thank you. Mike, when an offender is prosecuted, do they immediately become considered a sex offender and put on the sex offender registry?
Yeah, more often than not, especially if they're targeting child victims, they will also have to register as an RSO or a registered sex offender.
Okay, this is a question about the offender grooming. How do they go about that process? If they don't send any pictures themselves, is there a way that they are doing this with children?
The online part of it starts with whatever contact they can make inside any of those social networking sites that Mike put up earlier with a hello, a simple hello, and then inquiring, trying to pretend that they're interested perhaps in the young person's background. What we're hearing from some young people is all it takes is, now think about yourself when you're 12, 13, 14 years old. Someone tells you you're very beautiful, you're very attractive, and that's the hook for some of these young people. They get someone to tell them they're beautiful, and it goes on from there. That's on the internet-only online side. When you talk about the pedophiles in other older style, I guess you could say, grooming situations, it's the person who has contact with children and can work on that child gradually and befriend that child, finds a child who is in a situation where they can be alone with that child and then just start grooming that child towards sexual acts. That's in the person-to-person contact area. In the online contact area, it's whatever social networking site or communication they can develop with that child.
Stephanie, I also want to comment that on the online site too, a lot of these underage females and males would post a lot of their personal information. So both in the online avenue and in the face-to-face world, these pedophiles will try to develop a common bond with these kids, and that's part of their grooming process. So as these pedophiles find out what these kids likes, dislikes, interests, what they like to wear, what school they go to, whatever else they post online, or these pedophiles find out through talking with them, it's just like trying to befriend them. Once they befriend them, then they have their hooks in, so to speak, and they go from there.
I want to add one more thing to what Frank and Bruce said. We're not just talking about chatting. What a number of these subjects do is they will video chat with, let's say, a 17-year-old male. What they're going to do is they're going to record that video chat of that 17-year-old male, and then they're going to use that recording as what I would call a virtual mask, so that when they start targeting 13, 14-year-old, we heard as young as 8 years old, these kids believe because it's a webcam, a video call, that they can trust who's on the other side of that camera. So that's another way that they're grooming. And I think it's important that we got to say to kids too, when you're webcamming, just because you see somebody on the other end and it's an image, it doesn't mean it's them either.
Mike, how much of the 105 years that you discussed the perpetrator received, how much of that will he actually do, spend time in prison for that crime?
Yeah, I actually have little doubt that he will get out before the 105 years. His crimes are so egregious, they're well documented. That was, he should be in for longer if you ask me, but he'll be in there. Sometimes, I know there's a tendency that maybe on good behavior or something like that, a subject may get out early. We haven't seen that with the sextortion subjects who target children yet.
Thank you.
On the federal level,
go ahead.
yeah, if it's on the federal level, production of a child pornography, just one picture or video, will get a mandatory minimum of 15 years. And in the federal level, there is no parole or early release. They'll do the full time.
Thank you, Bruce.
And Stephanie, on the local side, when I worked in Arizona, there was a mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison for one image. That with Hawaii, where we're seeing offenders on child pornography cases get a day in prison. So it varies from state to state.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for that information. Frank, are these victims being given resources and referrals for support and counseling when the victims are identified?
Yes, and a lot of agencies, and I know my FBI and HSI colleagues have victim advocates that will work with children now. At the local level, that support is going to vary based on what's available in your jurisdiction. But many jurisdictions have victim support networks available and resources available. Others do not. So it's going to vary by jurisdiction. Find out what's available in your jurisdiction and then do the best you can to improve that if you have any ability to do that.
Thank you. One question came in. Can these pictures, once they're out on the internet, can they ever really go away? Is there a way to take them off of the internet?
And the answer is no, sadly. You can, and I've had some success contacting internet service providers and saying, hey, you've got this image up there, and some of them are good about taking them down and some of them are not. But every moment that they're up there, some other person out there can be and is copying those and posting them somewhere else. Bruce and Mike?
So I think that's right, Frank. If they submit the images to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, the child victims or the victims will have the ability to say they want to know when it's been identified again, and they don't have to know it. You're right. I mean, once they're up, they can be traded, and then it's upon the child victim to decide if it's identified again, do they want to know about it or not, and their family.
Thank you. This can be directed to all three of you guys. Do you have any thoughts on how someone can help youth ministries understand the concerns and provide educational materials such as this presentation?
On how they can provide the information, there's lots of resources online by Googling sextortion or crime prevention or going to sites like the National Center's sites, and you'll see videos and handouts and things that you can share at your youth ministries. Reach out to your local law enforcement agencies and see if they have people available that can come and do presentations. Depending on staffing levels, they may or may not be able to help you. And I also know my HSI and FBI folks get out there once in a while and do presentations. So go ahead, Bruce and Mike.
Yeah, there's also Net Smarts. That's part of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They have a lot of good, I guess, for different parents, groups, educators, teens, the elementary school level, all kinds of different presentations and I guess guidance. And that's another good website to go to. It's netsmart with a Z.org. That's by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And like Frank said, the National Center has a lot of information and guidance that's out there also.
I know that the Internet Crimes Against Children task forces also go around and do a lot of public awareness and education. So I'm sure that if there's anyone out there that would like to have their ministries, churches, synagogues, mosques get in touch with their ICAC commander in their state, that they'd be happy to come out and do a presentation as well. Thank you all very much for participating today. I want to thank our presenters again, and I want to thank the audience. I do have some information about an additional Sextortion webinar that we did in September with the REMS TA Center. You can go to www.rems.ed.gov and you can see a webinar called Incorporating Sextortion Response and Recovery into School Emergency Operation Plans. That webinar is specifically focused on schools, but it may be helpful. And this concludes our webinar today, and I'm going to turn it over to Carissa.
Thank you, Steffi. I would also like to thank our presenters for a great discussion on the topic and appreciate everyone's patience with the technical difficulties. We have just a few brief reminders. This webinar will be archived on OJJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. And to learn more about the topics discussed, please feel free to contact our presenters directly by accessing their contact information on this slide that's following. The information is also available in the PowerPoint located in the handouts pod for download. And again, all the information will be available on the OU on the online university in approximately 3 weeks. And for more information, please contact OJJDP or NTTAC. And lastly, we would appreciate if everyone could please take 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey. And thank you again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.